Good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline Rodriguez, and I am the Community Engagement Manager with Toronto Arts Foundation. We're delighted that you'll be able to join us today for this webinar. I'll keep my remarks brief, as my role here today is really as a moderator for our Q&A period at the end of the webinar, and to help troubleshoot any technical issues as they arise. As some of you know, the Foundation is hosting this webinar as part of our Creative Champions Network. Ginny Stolk, our network director, will be giving a brief overview of what that program is in a few moments for those of you who might be new or have not heard of it. With that being said, this is only our third webinar that the network is hosting, and while we hope for a smooth session, we're grateful for your patience as we do troubleshoot any issues that might come up. Next on my list is to just set the proverbial stage for today's webinar. After these introductory remarks, we'll proceed with our presentation. Brett will be sharing his screen with everyone as we have a small PowerPoint deck to accompany today's remarks. If you have a question for our presenters, we ask that you use the Q&A function, not the chat function, as the questions tend to get a little bit buried in there. Please feel free to ask a question at any time during the presentation via the Q&A function. If your question is for a specific presenter, try and identify them in your question to us so that we're able to direct it accordingly. We will address questions at the end of the presentation, so a bit closer to that 3 o'clock hour. We'll strive to get to as many questions as possible, and we'll prioritize the most frequently asked questions. Now, while no one did request ASL interpretation for this event, or this session, I should say, the deck and the URL will be made available following today's presentation, and it will be on our Foundation website. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make that recording available and a transcription of the session available as soon as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Ginny Stolk, our Creative Trust Fellow and leader of our Creative Champions Network. Ginny?
Thank you, Jacqueline. As always, and to Alex Lowen from the Toronto Arts Foundation, it's always wonderful to have the support of a team devoted to making all of our Creative Champions activities, including these webinars, so successful. And as you know, I'm especially grateful to have your steady hands on the Zoom technology. So as Jacqueline said, today's webinar is the third in our series providing guidance for arts board members confronting the pandemic. Recordings and transcripts of the previous two are up on the Toronto Arts Foundation's website under Creative Champions. If you go there, you'll also find a very rich trove of resources that we've chosen to be useful to arts board members on topics we've highlighted in the previous 27 workshops and learning sessions we presented over the past 5 years. And these sessions have definitely more than once dealt with the board's role in fundraising, which is a perennial topic of interest to board members. So as board members, as human beings living in this world, we're definitely living in the eye of a storm. We've gone from fears of illness to distress and isolation, from missing the habits and patterns of our old lives to uncertainty about whether they'll ever be back, to real concerns about our economic future, and firm reminders that we do not, in fact, want to return to social and economic structures that oppress and disadvantage many Canadians. Add to that a lot of uncertainty about the future of the arts organizations we love and have chosen to dedicate our time, energy, and resources to. Only a few months ago, people were discussing whether now was the right time to be fundraising for the arts. That didn't stop anyone, if my inbox is any indication, from going right ahead and calling for support and assistance to get through these very trying times, and quite rightly. For board members who I think are the majority, if not all of the people on this session, I hope and expect that vigorous outreach to supporters and stakeholders has been part of your efforts to secure the futures of your organizations. I've certainly seen in some cases an even deeper commitment by senior volunteers to reach out to donors personally and with passion. And it does seem to be one of the most important things we as board members can do right now to safeguard the mission and art of the organizations we have the legal obligation to sustain. Bringing energy, good ideas, and compassion to the table also gives us an opportunity, I have found, to match the incredible, astounding creativity and courage on display by artists and arts managers. At our last webinar, we learned that resilient organizations are well prepared for change, regardless of the type or magnitude of the transformation they may face. We also learned that it's not too late to adopt the lessons of resiliency, wherever your organization stood at the beginning of the pandemic. I've certainly observed that some organizations are doing much, much more than holding on. They're building support by responding to this current crisis with confidence, clear communications, and ideas that capture the imagination of a public that I think is yearning for innovative leadership. I think we're very lucky to have two people with us today who are very well positioned to help us understand the environment and practices that are resonating most strongly. Brett Egan, our first speaker, comes with a wealth of experience in providing planning and training to arts organizations in the US, Canada, and around the world. And he's been very, very actively involved in the responses to the pandemic. And Sandy Houston, President and CEO of the Metcalf Foundation, which has been one of the country's most important private programs of support to performing arts organizations, will share his perspectives and insights into what the funding and philanthropic communities see ahead. Michael Trent, his associate at Metcalf Foundation, is also with us and will be available to answer a few questions as well. Before we call on Brett, I just want to acknowledge the sacred land where we live and work, which has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years as the traditional territory, the gathering place of many nations. As Indigenous people throughout the world know, the earth is a sacred place and we are its custodians. We live on the shoulders of ancestors who survived crisis and devastation, and it's now time for us to step up in ways that will enable history to judge this moment not only at the time of tragedy, which it is, but also as a catalyst for a global awakening and for change to the avoidance and denial that have allowed systemic anti-Black racism, shameful inequities suffered by Indigenous peoples, and the degradation of the land, plants, and animals with whom we share this world. That being said, I'm going to ask Brett to begin our webinar. Thank you, Brett.
Jenny, thank you. And Jacqueline, thank you. And big thanks to the Toronto Arts Foundation and to Creative Champions. I'm honored to spend some time with you this afternoon. It's been mentioned that our team has been involved in the response to the pandemic. We're a consulting and training firm based in Washington, D.C. We work broadly throughout the country, a bit in Canada, quite a bit in Europe, and over the course of the last 15 years that we've been working on every continent except for Antarctica, pretty substantially in Africa and pretty substantially in Asia and in the Middle East. We do a lot of work around capital campaigns, strategic planning for new institutions. But our heart is as managers, our entire team, including your colleague Ben Dietschy in Toronto, who's part of our team now, all come from running institutions, all come from running arts organizations. I gave a very healthy head of hair to this business as my testament of dedication to this line of work. And it's through that lens that we approach this work. It's a fairly no-nonsense approach. We believe that when we produce art and program that is truly special, and when we market that aggressively, we build a group of people who want it to succeed. Board members are part of that, what we might call family. So our donors, our philanthropies, our strategic partners. And when we give that group of well-wishers the opportunity to help at moments like this, they do, and produce the revenue that we need to invest in more great art again the next year, market that aggressively, and that family continues to swell. And this is what we think of as a cycle of commitments that as managers and board members, we swear to protect and invest in. Meaningful art, strong marketing, a strong and generous family, and mechanisms to convert the goodwill of that family into the revenues, whether that be financial or labor or strategic partnership that we need to invest again the next year in great art. And this is how we approach this work. I would say that during this particular period that we find ourselves in, where there are so many questions and so many unprecedented factors that we're all dealing with, we have not wavered substantially from that commitment, that it remains true that the organizations that produce meaningful content, we might call it field-leading content, even dominant. By dominant, I don't mean that I want to quash the competition. What I mean is that if we're going to be in this, we sure as heck better be doing something that is not redundant in the field, that is seen by enough people to be really leading the field. That remains vital during this period, that strong communication, aggressive, what we might call institutional marketing that tells the story of the institution, not just the social media and the e-blasts and the brochures that tell you our performance is at 7:30 p.m. on Thursday night, here's how you buy a ticket. That's what we might call programmatic marketing, important for sales, but institutional marketing is a story that says, look, during this period of time, as much as ever, our institution has a story, it has a mission, it has an importance, and we want you to follow us along that thread. And I think board members can play a role in helping to tell that story. It's important that there's strong coordination between staff and board there. That together with truly a unique value proposition in the art leads to the development of a group, which I know many of you are part of, a board of directors, trustees, donors, sponsors, members, subscribers, strategic partners, the people who will go to the mat for the organization when the going gets tough. And we've sure seen that during this last period of time, over the course of the last, I guess, 3 months plus now. If we think of the second week in March, here we are heading into the third week of June. Better part of 3 months and a week, 2 weeks, we have been testing these hypotheses. Is it true that that a argument regarding a valuable proposition, a strong institutional narrative, can build a group of people who want you to succeed and will take care of you? We've seen many cultural organizations who paid attention to those principles. I'm not going to say flourish during this period. I don't think anybody is flourishing during this period, but being surprised by the level of support and reward that they've received from that group of people. And this is something that we focus religiously on, how to build a sense of loyalty, sense of momentum, enthusiasm amongst that group of people who during these particular times, and also during better times, help not only keep an organization afloat, but help it flourish. Let's go back to mid-March. As we've been thinking about this period and thinking about the role that board members can play, we've defined 4 phases. I'd like to briefly talk about 3 of them today, because I think that they're the most critical ones and they're the hardest ones. The 4th phase is really what long-term lessons can we lay into the fabric of our organizations coming from this fiery, hot cauldron of change and of questioning and of reinvention. When we go back to mid-March, we found ourselves, all of us, I think, trying to understand what this meant for all of us and trying to name the gap that remained when business shut down. For many of us, that was a gap presented by a loss of earned revenues. For some of us, it was also a gap that was proposed to be lost from the decreased contributed revenues or philanthropic revenues. But we were all struggling to find this number and then putting together a plan to try to bridge it. And I state this again at pains of sounding redundant with what we all know. Sadly, I'm afraid we're not fully out of this particular phase. I think many organizations are still straddling this phase and the next phase, which I'll talk about, largely because the goalpost keeps moving. Remember, in mid-March, many of us thought we would be back at business by now. We thought, how long could this possibly last? How long does this distancing last? How long could our theaters possibly shut? Is this thing really that serious? And now here we are in mid-June, most major cultural organizations in North America are saying we're not going to be back before January, earliest, possibly February. Nutcrackers are being canceled, entire seasons are being canceled. Many of the largest institutions, as I'm sure you all well know, have said we may not be back for the entirety of this season. We may not be back until fall of 2021. So this tactic of understanding and bridging the gap, sadly, is something which requires ongoing deliberation and analysis. I'm not going to dwell too much on how that's established, but here's what I would like to say, is that during this period of time, in respect to bridging the gap, I've seen two very different responses from fundraising campaigns. On the one hand, what we might call a dark abyss effort, and on the other hand, what we might call a finite point effort. And by the way, I'm not writing a book about this. I hope to never use these terms again in my entire career. I think we could all probably agree that we wouldn't necessarily want to revisit this. So I'm not spending time branding these terms, but the point I think is important. The Dark Abyss campaign said, help, exclamation mark, pandemic, exclamation mark, help, exclamation mark. It didn't give the donor confidence that by giving, they wouldn't be giving good money after bad. In other words, there was nothing in the message that said, here's our gap, here is how we have proposed to bridge the gap, here's what we've done in order to get this number as low as possible, here are the things that we have already brought in, here's what our board is doing, here's what our staff is doing, here's our plan. But rather sent out, in many cases, an email to everybody on the email list saying, we need you. And I saw that most of these campaigns, especially in the first few weeks of the pandemic, had some positive outcome, but not what was expected and not what was needed. And I'm afraid that in many cases, that kind of dark abyss campaign did damage. What I mean by that is that it conveyed a sense that we didn't have the discipline to do everything in our power before we made the radical ask that somebody make a contribution during this period of time. In the United States, I think many of my colleagues have really, truly come to take for granted the philanthropic impulse. I don't, because I know how hard it is to get the right gift. I'm not interested in getting what I might call go-away gifts, which is I ask you 7 times, and in order to get me to go away, you give me $100 or $250 when I know you could be giving me $2,500 or $5,000 or $10,000 or $25,000. We all know what the go-away gift feels like. But I still believe philanthropy is a radical act of love. I think that that's what we're going for here. We are trying to get individuals who have earned money or come into money that can be spent on anything. And we are trying to make the argument that we are the place where they ought to spend. And right now, I think being able to testify that the investment will produce a return, and the return is the preservation of the beloved asset. People need to see that strategy. So I have strongly preferred during this period of time, and I'm going over this again now because I think that many of us will find ourselves in several cycles of understanding bridging the gap and then having to fund the gap. I strongly prefer what I would call a finite point fundraising campaign, which is to say, look, here we are, June 22nd. We've just made the horrible decision to cancel all programming through the end of the year, hypothetically. Our gap is $150,000.50. And we have taken A, B, and C steps to get it down to $150,000.50. And we have brought in X, Y, and Z monies, including perhaps a seat from our board that can be matched, et cetera. Matching campaigns, very, very successful during this period of time. Give people a lot of confidence that the goal can be met. And it's not just their money, but others' money that's being matched and being brought in to help solve the problem. Finite point says, here is the finite point that we need to get to where we're thinking we might be able to start bringing in new revenues. We need your help to get there so that the donor can see that their $500 or $1,000 or $2,500 is really moving the needle against a clear goal. And there was a vast difference I found in the narratives, and still I'm finding, by the way, in the narratives of fundraising campaigns that attempt to reach the public between the Dark Abyss campaign and the Finite Point campaign. Now, Simultaneously, in phase 2, what I might call calibration, we're starting to see, I think, Jenny, you were talking about this earlier on, we're starting to see these pea shoots of innovation. We're starting to see this grappling with how can we continue to add value during this period of time. And I saw 3 basic responses, and I'm still seeing 3 basic responses. One, what we might call dormancy. It is what it sounds like. It's organizations, mostly fairly wealthy organizations, by the way, that have been able to amass institutional wealth in the form of working capital, saying, you know what, we're not going to try and reinvent ourselves here. We're not going to scramble too hard. We're going to sit tight. We're going to keep our costs low. We're going to keep our head down, and we're going to wait this thing out. The second form of response, what I call digitized business as usual, was, I imagine many of you on the call are parts of organizations that put things online during those first few weeks. Here's where I am on online. The space was already super saturated. Now I find it to be soggy and muddy and a bit treacherous to wade through. And I fear that a lot of our organizations rushed into that space. It was very instinctual to rush into that space, but did it without having a clear through line between the investment and the return on the investment. And what I mean by that is, as with any programmatic investment, I want to know what is the outcome of this investment. And online, I think for some reason we looked at it less critically during that period. I think we're still looking at it with a fairly uncritical eye. But if the organization is able to say, look, we're an arts education organization, we're a youth development organization, we have a chorus or a choir, for instance, and those young people have been coming to rehearsal with us 3 times a week since September. It's here, it's March. We're going to keep these rehearsals online from March through June to maintain that momentum and that cadence in order to preserve tuition, in order to keep them involved so that they come back again next year, in order to continue to provide value for our constituents who are paying us to do that. That's a very clear through line. Keep the tuition, maintain registration, attempt to convey, for instance, to donors that we haven't stopped. A second big investment that took place, trying to engage what I might call the core family during this period of time. So more nuanced, intimate gatherings, if you could call a Zoom gathering intimate. I don't know. We're all in uncharted territory here. But organizations that, for instance, created kind of backstage type events or donor lounges, online donor lounges, found some success in appealing to the donor mentality that they wanted to remain involved in the inside track of the organization. What are these guys thinking? How are they going to get through this? What are they dreaming of during this period of time? What are their difficult, there were these kind of performances of social theater, these rituals of electronic gathering that did inspire certain donors. So there was certain investment online that was targeted specifically at engaging core members of the family during this period of time. And by the way, if you look very closely, I have so little time today, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it's very interesting to see. When you look at the online work focused on donors, it really maps in a lot of respects to the same work that we do as fundraisers in the real world. It appealed to 4 different donor types: mission-driven, access-driven, socially driven, status-driven. Mission-driven is they respond very well to the core work that we do. These are our favorite donors, by the way. They don't ask for a lot in return. They're very loyal. They will go to the mat for us when we say, we believe this, we need your help to achieve this. Access-driven, they want access to people, places. They want access to power brokers. They want access to artists. For them, they're really renting access to experiences or people through the organization. Slightly different take. Socially driven, they want to call on their birthday. They don't need to go all the fancy parties, but they would really appreciate it if we remembered their granddaughter's name and where their granddaughter went to school. And it's a very different kind of social relationship that needs to be authentic. I'm not suggesting it's not authentic, but it's very different than being invited to all the great parties. And then status-driven, they want their name carved into a wall. And these are people who you saw, by the way, underwriting major online activities during this period of time, have their name in the proverbial, not headlights. I guess we all fill in the headlights a little bit now. And the name on the marquee, you know what I mean, above the title. They want their name chiseled into the wall. Mission, access, social life status. Even online, those 4 laws of engaging donors still really ring true. So organizations that were able to draw a through line between the investment and the return on investment makes sense to me. A less specific strategy, what I might call a spray and pray strategy. I'm going to spray as much out there as possible and pray that somebody pays attention to it. We're worried there about that investment. But then there were also these kind of emergent strategies that evolved, what I call startling innovation during this period of time, where you see children's museums go to food shelters and say, look, the kids can't come to us right now. We can't get to the kids, but you're seeing the kids every day because they're picking up their lunches from you because they can't get them from school anymore. We're going to create a little Happy Meal box. You all remember the Happy Meal. We're going to put a museum in a box, and we're going to put the food inside of the box, and we're going to send the young person home with a museum in the box. They rethought how to distribute their content during this period of time. Same instinct as the modern dance company in New York City that rents a old drive-in movie theater up the Hudson River Valley, heading up towards you guys, and says, hey, everybody, get in your car. We're going to give you a song to download on your iPhone. You're going to hook it up to your Bluetooth, and you're all going to park in an abandoned drive-in, and we're going to have you all press play at the same time, and then our dancers are going to create a world around you, and we're going to do it for 60 minutes, and it's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen. It's going to be totally safe. Nobody's going to see each other. Nobody's going to talk with each other. You're all going to be in your cars. It's going to be socially distant par excellence, but it's an innovation in our form. And we see these relentless artistic directors saying, you know what, it's not good enough for me to just sit still. I'm not happy to just sit still. I'm going to continue to try to add value. And so from a board member's perspective, if I had a 1-2 strategy here, it would be a finite point fundraising campaign on the back of a startling innovation. That would be my preference, to be going out to my friends and colleagues, to my family, and saying, look, I need you involved right now. I need you involved for this reason, very specifically. It's a very specific campaign. This is our bridge. This is how we're getting from point A to point Z. We don't need a cent more, but we do need this money. And when we do, we're going to be okay until we have to come back to you if the goalpost gets shifted again. God forbid we need to do that. Right now, the strategy is to get through January 1st. And this is what it's going to take. And look at what my organization is doing. Look at how relentless, how furtive, how agile they have been during this period of time, going down to the magma hot core of our mission and reinventing what delivery can look like. And it really was during this period of time that we saw which organizations had taken pains to really invest in the cultivation of family, and those who had not. There's that old expression, or at least in my mind it's old. I don't know how old it is. It may not actually be old, but in my mind it is. You don't see who's swimming naked until the water goes out. You all know that one. It means, when the tide goes out, you can finally see who's been swimming naked. Well, during this period of time, people who had invested in family actually have found themselves, in many cases, stronger sitting here on June 22nd than they were last year on June 22nd. And it's not too late, by the way, to reinvest in family. That practice is something that goes on all the time. Right now is the time to use our underemployed artists in many cases, and so many gut-wrenching conversations I've had over the course of the last 3 months. We did a pro bono initiative here in the States where we invited any arts, culture, or heritage institution in the United States to apply for free consultation. And we did free consultations with over 450 organizations in 8 weeks. If I had any hair left to give, it would have been gone after that period of time. But what we learned during this period of time was that a lot of people were struggling with, should we keep our dancers engaged, our actors engaged? And I said, look, if you can figure out, and I realize this is a special time and these are not laws that we would want to perpetuate all the time, but if you can figure out how to pivot them into a way to cultivate the family and possibly be involved in helping to fundraise by writing personal notes, by making phone calls, by instead of sending an e-blast to all 4,332 people on our mailing list, to take 42 of those people out of that list who can make a big difference and actually write them a letter from an artist, or actually call them and tell them what's going on. What a world of difference that would make to take care of our family in that way. And some of them have done that. And I'm continuing to encourage that, because I think that now more than ever, but almost certainly in this fall and next spring, we're going to need those people closer than ever. And people who are not paying attention to that, I think, are wasting time. That is perhaps the highest priority right now. In addition, and this is highly technical, so I won't go into it in much detail today. I'm happy to answer more questions on this later if you'd like, but we have given up on trying to plan for the entirety of next year. Anybody who spent any time with us will know that we are very strong advocates of long-term planning. We insist when we work on a strategic plan that a 5-year artistic plan is built, because we believe that it is not possible to fundraise for programming unless you have the time to develop new relationships around new ideas, and that if you're constantly planning on 11 or 12-month cycle, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're always talking about the next most urgent, most needy thing with all the same people you talked about the next most urgent, most needy thing with last year, because you haven't given yourself time to dream, to let that air out and find new people. But right now, yes, we are actually continuing to write quite a few strategic plans during this period of time. I actually think it's an incredibly exciting time to be thinking long-term. But practically speaking, we are budgeting on a quarterly basis. We're looking at go and no-go dates for each quarter. In my mind, what that means is if I'm thinking, okay, I have a January 15th performance, I know in order to get that performance where I need it to be, I'm going to have to press go or no-go by November 15th. And I find that those quarterly budgets with quarterly programming plans, with very clear trigger dates, can produce a sense of ease on the staff side and produce a sense of consensus between staff and board. It's a lot more work. Nobody wants to do it. I don't want to do it. I'm swimming in scenarios, as I'm sure many of you are, but that is the scenario in which we find ourselves. We have no choice. It's not uncommon in my experience to have 3 or 4 scenarios actually for every quarter between now and June of 2021. It's remarkable how much work it is, but it's also critical. The last phase that I'd like to discuss today, recovery. Oh, by the way, before I move on, phases 1 and 2, triage, calibration. I think we should expect to find ourselves going back and forth between those 2 phases for another 3 or 4 months until things become more clear. Hopefully they will become clear. I think the bottom line is, guys, until there's a vaccine, the large performing arts institutions and visual arts institutions are not going to be able to convey confidence. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a financial expert, I'm reading all of the same information that you are, but I think that that's basically what it's boiling down to, or and unless, or in addition, something that looks like herd immunity is achieved. I think that's the thing that nobody wants to truly admit, but that is the lingering fact, is that until one of those 2 things is achieved, our businesses will not be back to usual unless we can find some ways to work around the sides of the business. And by the way, I think that our smaller and mid-sized cultural institutions, I would say, under 5 million, there's no magic to that number, roughly speaking, almost functions as an R&D laboratory during this period in time, a research and development laboratory that says, look, when a big institution turns their light on, they start going through $5,000 bills or $10,000 bills every hour of opening. It's very difficult for them to experiment with form. But our smaller and mid-sized cultural organizations, I think, have some first mover advantage here and have a little bit more flexibility to help show us the light, help show us how to work around some of the constraints that we're facing. And I'm seeing, frankly, most of the most important and exciting innovation come from that part of the sector.
Brett, I'm just wondering whether it would be a good moment right now to bring Sandy and Michael in. What you've had to say is incredibly rich and incredibly reflective of what I, and I think many of us, have been observing in Canada, which is good to know, but God knows the challenges are huge. Can we bring Sandy in and then go back to the recovery ideas that you have? Because
absolutely.
I'm sure that they're just as challenging but inspiring as what you've just said.
You bet.
Thank you so
absolutely.
much. So can we, Sandy, as a major funder with a big focus, not your only focus at the Metcalf Foundation, but a big focus on arts and cultural organizations, particularly performing arts organizations. What are you seeing, and how are you seeing foundations, but also, I would say, individual philanthropists, the world of philanthropy, as far as you can read it? What's the inside scoop, Sam? Could you unmute?
Thanks, Janie. I'm unmuted. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I would love to have heard more of Brett's presentation. There was a lot there, I think, for all of us. I'll be fairly quick, and I'll set up my remarks from a fairly specific perspective. I work for a foundation, and as I think people on the call probably know, that's a relatively small piece in the overall performing arts ecosystem. You know, for reasons that we would explore, I think, on another call, organized philanthropy in Canada, many of them do not have a deep relationship with arts and culture. They're in other places. Arts and culture funding tends to come either from individuals, our public sector funders, maybe some of the smaller foundations, but in the world of organized philanthropy in Canada, unfortunately, arts and culture is not usually a leading strategy. That said, we are deeply committed to this space, so I can offer a few comments on what we're seeing, and then a few comments about more broadly what seems to be going on with philanthropy in a time of uncertainty and crisis. We work with exactly that sector that Brett was identifying, the small and mid-sized performing arts organizations who really are, it seems to us, the innovators and sort of an extraordinarily resilient group of creators and managers. And that is where we've placed our focus. And our work has largely been about enabling them to innovate and enabling them to experiment and enabling them to learn and share with each other to make themselves collectively stronger, working with the underlying assumption that you are going to be facing constant change, and the tools that you are going to need are going to be the tools that enable you to cope with the reality of constant and often unsettling change. That's been a reasonably good strategy. In the last 3 months, that's a difficult strategy, and what we've decided to do, along with many others, is simply say, we will put our resources where they're most needed by you. We've shifted a lot of our funding to unrestricted core funding to be applied as needed, wherever needed. And we've seen that more broadly with colleagues. We are seeing among sort of looking across the Canadian not-for-profit sector, the performing arts seems to be about the most badly hit, along with recreational groups. Ginny circulated a whole lot of great resources in anticipation of this call. One of them was a fairly recent survey from Imagine Canada, which is the umbrella group for the sector, which if you're interested in sort of getting a snapshot, I would recommend to you. And under their data, which is May, I mean, it looks like this sector has taken a harder blow than the rest for reasons I think you all understand around, you know, the lack of earned revenues, the requirement on bringing people together. I mean, it's sort of a witch's brew in terms of creating a set of circumstances that are extremely difficult for those organizations. The impact of that has been, you know, enormous uncertainty, impact on people, and I think maybe more tellingly, a challenge of trying to determine the path forward. And I want to touch a little bit on this piece and then connect it to some broader trends that I think philanthropy more generally is looking at right now. One of the things that it's emerged in a lot of conversations I'm in around what emerges out of COVID is the tension between how quickly can we get back to the way things were before versus how fundamentally do we have to reimagine and reconceptualize the way forward. And there are many in the not-for-profit and philanthropic world who are deeply interested in the potential that this crisis represents for structural and systemic change, and view it as having brought into high relief a whole set of challenges which are now being illuminated in a way they weren't before and present an opportunity for change. The cultural sector and the arts, performing arts in particular, are not immune from that, I think. There are all sorts of questions that underlie or issues that underlie cultural practices in Toronto, everything from precarity of employment to inequity, to diversity and inclusion, to larger societal issues, which maybe deserve a larger role in the performing arts ecosystem than they have right now, that could be part of the way forward. When I look at sort of where a lot of the philanthropic energy I think is going, it's trying to think about how philanthropy addresses those larger conversations and what role they can play in enabling a robust examination of possibilities. And it seems to me that's something that arts and culture may want to connect with more robustly than perhaps they're doing now. Maybe it isn't appropriate for your arts organization, and maybe that makes no sense. But I would suggest that some of those larger issues more explicitly brought into the arts conversation is a place where it might be possible to grow your constituency or grow your tent and ecosystem in a way that the circumstances pre-COVID may not have made so obvious. I liked Brett's phrase about startling innovation and plans about startling innovation. And I think one of the things that boards and organizations may want to think about through this period, particularly in a period, oddly enough, whereas so many things are quieted and slowed down, there is perhaps a greater opportunity for thinking, planning, and imagining than there would be typically. What are the kind of innovations that are going to carry the arts and culture sector forward robustly? Is it a distinct possibility that we are not actually going to come back to something that looked like what it was before entirely, that we will actually have to function in some way differently, that we may need to carry a different set of conversations and priorities than we did previously? And what might organizations need in order to enable them to meet those kind of challenges in ways they haven't been asked to before? So I think some of those things are interesting. I think there's a whole piece in the broader philanthropic world around innovation and innovation's connection to positive social change, where the arts have an enormously important role to play. And where, again, it may be a possibility as arts organizations look forward to think about how they get more explicitly into those conversations. I think one thing we'd say at Metcalf, and we work in the environmental sector and we work in poverty reduction as well, is the arts are incredibly innovative and resilient and extraordinarily good at managing and creating and thriving under adverse circumstances. But curiously, there's a lot of larger tables that grapple with the larger issues that are typically set in any sort of societal roundtable, where for whatever reasons, art organizations are not there. They're often not seen as being, they're just forgotten in the larger conversation about social finance or social innovation, where a lot of energy is being devoted to this reinvention conversation. The arts organizations tend to be overlooked a bit. And I think, coming out of this, if we're going to be in a time where a lot of new things are going to be in play and everyone's going to be asked to work differently and we're all going to need a new set of tools, crucially important that arts and culture be at those tables, be in those conversations, be invited into the room where they have an enormous amount to contribute. But it is something that strikes us at Metcalf, where we kind of look across the sector and are struck again and again by the places where the arts are thriving and leading the way and other places where they seem to have been a bit forgotten. So Michael Trent, who actually runs our performing arts program, is here with us today. And I think it would be great to have his perspective on some of these things quickly as well, recognizing that Ginny's tight on time. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Sandy. And I'll just say a couple of things that are coming to mind as I'm listening to both Brett and Sandy speak about their respective work. Some of the things that Brett said to me, which really resonated, was around this notion of storytelling and ways of building relationship with folks. And this notion of showing and not telling. And I think you gave a beautiful example of not just saying we need the money, but here's why we need the money. Here's the thing that we do that follows our mission, that heightens it, that raises it up. And I think the power of that storytelling is really what is going to keep those close relationships, what you call, Brett, family, really close at hand. In one of the programs that we did, part of our multi-year strategic funding program, was called Creative Strategies Incubator. And it was a focus issue designed program. And one of them was on building audiences and developing communities. And one of the outcomes of the work that this cohort did was this notion of looking at reach and depth. As a kind of a dual matrix to sort of understand how to build those things. And one of the potent conclusions that they came up with, and I think this is reflected in what Brett is saying, is that you need, first of all, to go into depth. And from depth, broad reach will occur, because you build those very, very close allies who are able to be your, to quote Ginny, the champions at your service. And so this resonated really a lot for me in terms of that. I think Sandy's notion around what we can do in arts and culture around the systemic piece is hugely important. It's an exciting space for arts and culture. And I think that boards can really bring that set of knowledge and that set of expertise to the table in really interesting ways. So it's something that I hope we see more of and hear more of, and really start to engender that conversation in a much more proactive way.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, everybody. Jacqueline, I seem to have completely have no time piece here at all, so I have no idea what time it is and how much more time we have left.
We have about 12 minutes left, and we have one question so far in our Q&A.
The one thing that I just want to throw in the mix, because what I've heard from everybody today has been so interesting and so true. And you are breaking my heart, Sandy, because the reason I stayed actively involved in the Ontario Nonprofit Network for a good 8 years was just to be sure that the arts were at the center of all these conversations. And maybe I'll have to join the board again. They won't have me, but anyway. The one thing I just want to lay out there without asking for questions or necessarily immediate comments is what does all of this mean for the role of the board? The role of the board, what does it mean around governance, and what does it mean about the kinds of boards we have and the work they do and how they think about their work and their real responsibilities, not just to the organization, certainly there, but also to the community and the world at large, and how does that change habit, practice, and action and choices. I will say that, but perhaps there'll be a couple of questions that Jacqueline can highlight that might have something to do with that, and we can get some further thoughts. Jacqueline?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are there questions from people?
There is one question right now. The question is, what is the intersection of the pandemic issues and the tension related to diversity right now? What challenges or opportunities may exist related to the confluence of these events?
Indeed. I think I'll call on Sandy to speak for that one.
It's a very timely question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it could be answered many different ways, and I am no expert on this at all. I think what many people are realizing is that there is a lot more work to be done in this space than was obvious or in the conversation some time ago. I think one of the ways that some people are trying to respond to that is to think about where, equity-led and equity-focused groups are in sort of the system in terms of their access to resources, in terms of how the funding systems work is one way to think about it. I think it goes to, what do our boards look like? What does our leadership look like? What is the behavior of funders in this space? There's certainly a view in some circles, many circles, that much more work needs to be done on responding to those challenges in a more enlightened and constructive way. There's certainly been a profound shift in attention and rhetoric recently, and I think a lot of people in those communities are now waiting to see what actions, funds, and changes follow behind that. And I think a lot of people of goodwill are trying to figure out how they and their organizations do things differently to respond to what's been identified. That would certainly be true of Metcalf, where we are certainly going to try to do more and better in this space. One thing we have done, just as our organization, as a small illustration of this, is we are creating a new funding stream within our arts, our COVID-related arts funding bucket, which was created this year, which is explicitly aimed at equity-led and equity-focused performing arts organizations, in recognition of the fact that those organizations probably have not received the same degree of benefit and support from Metcalf and a lot of other arts organizations historically than circumstances warrant, and that readjustment needs to happen, and we're starting to make those readjustments now. But your question is much larger than that, and I think lots of people are working their way through it.
Brett, could I ask you if you could make the connection between what Sandy just said and with the role of boards and the future of board activities and board thinking about their responsibilities?
Yeah. Quickly, I think that the role of the board remains primarily to function as an ambassador for the mission of the organization. I use the word ambassador very specifically. The role of the board can be thought of as either internally focused or externally focused. Many boards are too internally focused, in my view. They spend a lot of time meeting together, talking with each other, looking at pieces of paper. I'm not saying due diligence is not important. Right now, however, the critical role of the board is to build the family of the organization, which requires organization external to the internal affairs of the organization. I like to see, and would like to think, that board members over the course of the next year would pick a project, pick one specific thing that the organization is doing, learn about it, go deep in it, being mindful of the fact that staff is usually the one who needs to design and execute the project, but to look for very specific ways and listen to the ways in which staff are saying, look, we need partners, we need connections to community, we need, yes, money, but we are going to provide you with some additional tools to be able to bring that in. But pick something concrete that builds a bridge between the organization and the outside world. And do one big thing rather than 100 smaller things. I think that's a really important pivot that boards need to be considering as we move forward into this expected climate where money is going to be tougher, very likely than it has been in a generation to come by. And in terms of justice and in terms of equity, it's such a critical conversation. I see two opportunities. One is, sadly, we've lost workforce in arts and culture. And I think our situation in the States might be a bit better or a bit worse than it is in Canada. I don't know. I imagine we're pretty much on the same place. People have lost jobs. And so when we're thinking about rehiring, and that moment will come, how can we be thinking about that through a lens that is more equitable? And how can we be thinking about the connections that we have right now and the connections that we might need in 3, 6, 9, 12 months in order to be recruiting from different pools of individuals? I think that is a role that board members can be thinking seriously about. And the last thing I would say is, and I think comments just a few minutes ago about actions following words are very important. I think everybody with a conscience is understandably enraged right now, specifically about what's been happening in the States, but I know it's not limited here. And I understand in Canada you're working through many similar issues. Here it's just it's just an unending nightmare. And I say that from a position of privilege and knowing that I do not know the half of it or a tenth of it, but it is a nightmare for the country. And in our part of the world, our sector, I think the point made earlier about arts not being at the table, well, I think that has fallen to us in many cases because we have not taken pains to explain exactly how we can be necessary in the fight toward increased justice. And I have on the third bullet point here, necessary and extraordinary. One path coming back into this world is to be a necessary organization that builds systemic, not just surface level, systemic responses to issues of equity in our community. For instance, look at Philadelphia Mural Arts Organization. Philadelphia Mural Arts Program has a restorative justice program that works with young people that are coming out of the justice system, gives them a job, fixing walls, putting the scaffolding up, then being involved in a discursive process of creating a mural. But is a pipeline to employment itself. A systemic response is necessary. A systemic response is possible, I think, as we are rethinking our value proposition moving forward, looking for ways that we as organizations and then together as an aggregate, our sector, can be an important and systemic response to the inequities that our communities are facing. And I think board members can be helpful in thinking about the architecture of that and be helpful in encouraging not just a superficial response, but an actual, how will a multi-year program make a significant difference in some of the things that we all care about.
Thank you. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, because I have been reading, you know, the occasional comment about the arts as not being as essential as other issues in society right now. I understand where that comes from, but I would like to point out that every single one of us, you know, in each of our countries, is spending all of their spare time watching videos of performances, listening to music, downloading films, you know, participating in Stratford's Shakespeare Live public gatherings or private gatherings. So in a way, there's every opportunity to point out the fact that we are, in actual fact, entirely essential, and our continued continuation and the thriving of our community and the artists who speak from our stages is totally essential to the recovery and to the world. I'll just put that in. Jacqueline, are there any other questions that we can get to in the time that's remaining to us?
There's one more question I think we could try and hit in the minute we have left here. And I don't know if this question is exactly for you, Sandy, but you were talking about artists getting to the tables, those discussions. And the question is, how can artists get to these tables?
I'm not sure that I have a precise formula. I think the point I was trying to make is that when those large sort of tables are set to address the larger structural social issues, the fact that the arts are not automatically there speaks to something that we need to address. And they should be, and they must be, and the fact that they aren't means somehow there's a perspective around relevance or contribution or something else which is precluding that, despite the efforts of Ginny and many others to try and push against that. We do continue to see that, and I think, as I said, that coming out of this, it's really going to be terribly important that we change that and ensure that the relevance and contribution and insights and all the extraordinary things the arts can bring to all of these issues is front and center.
Yeah, there's a blind spot that I think we need to address and break through, although to me it seems obvious, but that's just me. Is there anything else, Michael? Did you have one final thought? Brett, did you have something that you wanted to leave us with?
Michael?
I'll leave it to you, Brett.
I would just respond to that last question briefly, because I think it's a critical one. I think it starts with listening and stopping talking so much. I think that in the arts, and I say this with a heart full of love for our sector, I've given my entire career to it, we have a tendency to become quite intoxicated with our own ideas about the future of our sector, of the form, of the world. And when it comes to being at the table, it's not what it's about. When it comes to being at the table where social service is, where education is, where sport is, where infrastructure is, the job there is to solve a problem. The job there is to be a problem-solving partner to a city or to a network or to solve a systemic challenge. And there we will use the tools that we have, which I think we're better equipped maybe than anybody. We're creative. We don't take anything for granted. We question everything. We think around every angle. We are problem solvers de facto. That's what we do. Our artists do that as a way of being. But we have to find a way to stitch together that instinct with a specific issue or challenge that the person with the money is asking to have solved. And I'm not saying that's what I would want the entirety of creative practice to be, but when we're talking about being at the table with other sectors, our job is to listen and solve a problem with our craft. And I think if we can make that strategic pivot and get out there and have conversations with city council people and with people who are running big departments inside of our city and saying, what are the 3 issues that seem intractable? What if we get together a focus group of artists and put together a workshop 2 weeks and let us come up with a solution to that, see if you want to fund it. That type of more customer-centric approach, I think. Now I'm really sounding like I'm from the States, I apologize, but I think that that's what this is about when we're saying being at the table. We have to be geared towards solving a problem.
So much to discuss, so many absolutely important things that we've talked about today. I am thrilled, and I thank you all, everybody who spoke today and everybody who tuned in to listen and to participate and to allow the ideas we've heard today to tumble around in their brains and help them come up with new insights and new ideas about how to be a board member and what their role is and what the role of the arts is. A very, very rich conversation. I'm very grateful to everybody. Jacqueline, is there anything else that I'm forgetting in terms of signing off, final comments? I think we're going to we're going to make an attempt to have one more webinar before we all go to our respective cottages or back rooms for the summer or backyards, which will be around our human resources, because it's so much not just money, but it's about people. And we're thinking that one through right now. We'll definitely let you all know when we've got that one pulled together. But until that time, thank you everybody, and it's been an incredible delight to be on this call with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.